Good day, guys. Welcome to episode 2. Uh, Here we are going to answer a very important question today. See, in the previous season, we built the SCOR map with 6 pillars and plan at the top. Last week, in our season 1 episode, we broke something very important. We proved the number feeding plan is structurally wrong. The forecast will always be off. So now there's only one question left to answer. If the number is always wrong, how do the best companies still build it so well? What does world class demand planning actually look like from the inside? That is what we are going to discuss today. And it begins with a kind of simple observation. And most organizations never make this observation explicit. See, most companies don't have a demand planning system, they have one leader with a fixed idea of what demand planning is. So, one function is asked to do three different jobs: shape the demand, predict the demand, react to demand, and reaction to demand is in real time. So, these are three separate cognitive tasks with three different time horizons and three separate stakeholders, which is reduced to one way of thinking, one leader, one lens, and one number. But when we talk about world class demand planning, organizations separate these three functions structurally. They have different reporting lines, different objectives, different meetings, and that separation is the single most important architectural decision in demand planning. Not the algorithm, not the software, the structure. So last week, the forecast is always wrong was discussed. Today, how the best companies build it anyway, and why most get it wrong before S&OP even starts. So look at the three panels on your screen right now. These are not steps in a process. They are three distinct functions that happen to share the word demand. Most companies run all three within one team. That does not make them the same job. Demand planning is commercial. It will ask you question, what should demand look like? The promotions, pricing, new launches, market entry, these come into picture over here, and it kind of shapes the future. It does not predict it. They have monthly to quarterly horizon. Demand forecasting on the other side is statistical and analytical. It asks you what demand do we expect and why. It converts intent into a number. It will drive your capacity, inventory, labor, and budget. And it must be independent. If it isn't, the forecast will always be biased. Now, demand management is execution. It will ask you what is happening and how do we respond. Kind of demand balancing, demand allocation, and back orders is included over here. And this is done on daily to weekly horizon. And this is reactive by nature. So one team can carry all three, but not with one mindset. So the diagnostic is very simple. Who owns the number? Is forecasting independent? What was done during the planning, and who has the veto power? The moment all three functions report to the same person, the function with the most organization power wins. And in most of the organizations, it is sales. And the statistical baseline disappears inside that win of sales. Most organizations collapse these three roles: blurring ownership, removing independence, and losing control of the number. That is not a people problem, it is an architecture problem. So, here is what actually happens to a demand number between the moment a data analyst builds it and the moment it runs in your supply chain. Stage 1 comes with statistical baseline, which has clean sales history. Promotions and everything are stripped out, which should not inflate the baseline. Outliers are documented. This is the only number in the entire chain that comes from data rather than opinion. It says clean on the screen. This is the most accurate number your organization will ever produce. And the irony is that nobody in your leadership team has ever seen this baseline data. Stage 2, sales comes into picture. They add their pipeline, they add their promotions, and their conviction about new product launch. See, for them, the volume targets come with, you know, bonus. So the number goes up not because of the data but because of incentive structure. Then marketing comes into picture. They add promotions, campaigns, event driven spikes are added. Some of these are real signals, but the number is again touched by second function with directional incentives. Stage 4, finance comes into picture. They have a budget to protect, so the numbers too high are capped, numbers too low are floored, not because the market says so, because the financial plan says so. The number has now become political. It reflects what the organization needs to be true, not what the data says is true. Stage 5, supply check. Capacity constraints are applied, lead time are adjusted. Sometimes the number gets compressed again because the supply base cannot deliver what finance approved. In the final stage, a contaminated plan is published, which is compromise, and this will run your procurement, your production, and warehouse positioning will be on this thing. And nobody in your organization formally owns the error when this goes wrong. So this is where it breaks. The plan that runs your supply chain has never, you know, worked on demand forecast. It was kind of a negotiation between different functions. So let us now talk about the belief that S&OP has, widely held, and which is consistently incorrect. That it is the primary reason why your forecast accuracy improves. Okay, that belief is on your left panel. S&OP doesn't improve your forecast accuracy. S&OP is a commitment process. It produces alignment on what the organization will do, what they will make, what they will buy, what they will sell. It does not improve the quality of the demand signal that entered the room. For example, let us take a brilliant S&OP which is run on a contaminated baseline will produce a perfectly aligned wrong number. See, the meetings will get better in future, but the inventory problem stays. Over time, the inventory problem doesn't improve. It will compound. Here is what the right panel is telling you. The demand review, the step 2 of the monthly S&OP cycle. It's kind of good like the trilogy we discussed. Because if demand forecasting is independent of sales and finance, with a clean baseline and a bias audit before submission of S&OP, then the demand review presents a number the organization can genuinely challenge and improve. If the trilogy is collapsed into one person, the demand review is a political presentation of a number that has already been negotiated before anyone walked into the room. See, most companies measure S&OP by how well the meeting runs. The leaders of the industry measure it by how clean the baseline was before anyone touched it. If you don't protect the baseline, S&OP will only scale your errors, not your accuracy. So every supply chain team I have worked with tracks kind of forecast accuracy, the MAPE, mean absolute percentage error. How far off were we on average? That is the standard measure, and I think it is the wrong one to lead with. See, forecast error will tell you the magnitude of your problem, but when it comes to forecast bias, it will tell you the cause, and the cause is everywhere and everything you want to know about. Now look at the three panels. When it comes to consistent over forecast, kind of organization produce more than market needed, then the inventory builds up, your cash is trapped, and this is not a forecast failure, this is again a trilogy failure. This is kind of your sales, uh, you know inflating your baseline for incentives. Consistent under forecast, again this is a trilogy failure, because the budget protection incentives is compressing the baseline. Most likely this could be finance. So finance is running your demand forecasting in this case. But when it comes to random error, where your errors are genuinely random, no function is systematically pulling the number. This is the only acceptable state. It means the demand forecasting function is independent. The trilogy is working. Now let us take the industry concept. See, when we talk about automotive, over there the plan is locked 72 hours in advance. For example, you planned for 1000 cars, but suddenly the demand goes up to 1030. Can you immediately add 30 more cars? No, that's not possible, because the parts were ordered for 1000 cars, and the production line isn't sequenced for 1030 cars. What happens is, even if one critical part is missing, the entire production line stops in automotive. So in most industries, a 3% error creates inventory, but in automotive it stops production. When we talk about consumer electronics, uh, it's more about predicting the shape of the curve. For example, in week 2 the demand is at peak, but the demand might die in week 14. So if forecasting and allocation sit with the same person, week 2 takes over everything. All focus goes to pushing stock into the market. And week 12, what will happen? There is no clearance plan, inventory is getting stuck. This is kind of the trick of the trade. If you don't design the decline, the market will do it for you. Now, the retail white goods, air conditioners, refrigerators, their demand is kind of compressed into 8 to 10 weeks of summer. So the game is won months before the season begins. The demand planning shapes the market with dealer incentives, early buy schemes, EMI offers. Demand forecasting has to predict the curve. And right now, the climate data shows the peak is shifting earlier every year. So, over here, if the curve is taken into consideration properly with seasons and everything, stockouts can be avoided. Because this is the reality. You cannot run pre-season strategy, forecasting, and execution with the same lens at the same time. See, every industry thinks its demand problem is unique. In every case, the trilogy is collapsed into one person running three different team horizons at the same time. Now, let us take a kind of a live example of a meeting, the demand review meeting. So, the statistical model on the table showed 40,000 units, but sales was presenting 65,000 with the rationale of a promotional campaign that quarter. The model cannot capture a campaign, and it could have but nobody put the campaign into the system. See, the finance approved 65,000 because it aligned with the revenue target for the quarter. The number that ran supply chain was not a forecast, it was a budget with a statistical baseline as kind of a decoration. What happened is the campaign drove a 30% uplift, not the 62% which was assumed by the sales. So 25,000 units sat in the channel, which was in future cleared at 35% discount. The statistical model, the one that had been overridden in a 20-minute meeting, was kind of correct. See, the model did not lose that meeting because it was wrong. It lost because there was no structural mechanism to protect it. No independent demand forecasting function, no bias audit before submission, no one who owned the baseline independently of the volume, conversation, and conversion. The model was correct, but it was not kind of protected. That is a trilogy architecture failure, not a forecasting failure. So here is what a properly built demand plan looks like. Not more accurate, but more honest. Layer 1 comes with, as we discussed, statistical baseline. This belongs to demand forecasting exclusively. Nobody from sales or finance touches this layer. It is clean historical data with documented assumptions. See, if the baseline moves, the demand forecasting function can explain exactly why, what changed in the data, what seasonal factors were applied, and what outliers were added or removed. Layer 2, the commercial outlay. This belongs to demand planning, promotions, distribution assumptions, launch spike, new sales, and everything is entered over here, and it should not be baked. It should be separate, visible, and attributable. If the overlay proves wrong, the error is traceable to the assumption that drove it. Layer 3, which comes with stated assumptions. Every assumption that moved the number from the baseline is written down with a number, a rationale, and a name. This is the most unpopular layer in every organization. Okay, so people do not like having their assumptions documented. That discomfort is the point. If an assumption cannot survive being written down and attributed, it should not survive the demand plan. Bias audit. See, before the plan goes to S&OP, recent forecast versus actuals are reviewed for direction. If the number is consistently over or under, the contamination chain is traced and challenged before submission in future. This is the quality gate the demand management function owns, preventing biased assumptions from entering the plan. In world-class systems, the statistical baseline is not negotiated. It is challenged, but it is not overwritten. Every disagreement sits on top of it as a documented overlay with a name attached to it. The baseline is kind of protected. The organization is allowed to disagree with it. It is not allowed to hide the disagreement inside it. So most companies get this wrong. They have one number and one meeting. World-class companies have 4 layers and 4 owners. That is not complexity, that is accountability. So in the previous season, the first season, we introduced customer order decoupling point as the most strategic manufacturing decision a company makes. Today I want to show you it from a completely different angle, the demand planning lens. Look at the slide. Everything to the left of that gold line, the push zone, is running on your demand plan. Your procurement decisions, your raw material staging, your production schedule, your warehouse positioning, all of it is driven by the number that came out of the trilogy process we have been decoding this episode. If the trilogy is working, independent demand forecasting, clean baseline, bias audit, the push zone carries the right inventory into the pull zone. If the trilogy is broken, contaminated baseline, sales or finance is running the forecast, the wrong inventory is kind of pushed to the pull zone. The CODP is where the truth arrives. A customer order comes in, reality has replaced forecast. The question is no longer what do we think will happen, it is what do we have and can we ship it. So every bias that survived the contamination chain, every assumption that has never returned down, every override that has approved in a 20-minute meeting, they are all sitting in your inventory position at this line. Push versus pull, is a full strategy concept. Where to position the CODP, how to move it, what it means for your manufacturing strategy. That is a dedicated episode kind of later in season 1. What matters today is this single connection. The quality of your trilogy determines the quality of your inventory at the CODP. They are the same decision expressed at different points in the supply chain. This is where it breaks. Every bias and assumption that survived the contamination chain arrives here as inventory. You either, kind of have too much inventory or too little. So these are some live figures. I mean, no demand plan can predict this, but a strong SNOP reacts faster because it already tags the gaps to different departments and keeps on tracking. And kind of have external shock system which they keep on tracking. So the gap that should have been visible earlier is now being managed as a crisis if this is not done. Okay. So vessel traffic has collapsed right now. Insurance costs are surging. The freight assumption in the plan which was done earlier is no longer valid. We are talking about a major trade route which is blocked. Supply plans which were locked kind of months or weeks ago are now wrong. So how do we handle such kind of situation is with the best resilience planning, S&OP planning. See, the disruption didn't start inside the company, but it is kind of now running through it. These are the signals. The plan hasn't failed, but the world has changed faster than the plan. See, plans don't break because they are wrong. They break because reality moves faster than the planning cycle. So I want you to do this calculation which will kind of take 15 minutes and kind of do it before the week is out. Not because it is kind of it will be comfortable, because you cannot fix a structural problem you have not named it. Pull the 3 months data and see how your demand plan works. Either it was over committed or under committed. Ask kind of questions: who challenged the statistical baseline, who increased or decreased it. Next episode we will come with forecasting methods. We'll decode qualitative versus quantitative methods, and what kind of decision framework is to be taken choosing the right method for your product, your industry, and your data quality. Guys, subscribe, and new episode every week. I hope this episode helped you to understand how world class demand planning is done. Maybe watch the episode again and make your points. uh, Comment your industry, comment about your findings from this episode and your experience. So this is SCM Decoded for you, the global supply chain community we are building with real operations, deep theory decoded. Thank you so much.